Hey, before the video starts, I want to say thank you to Storyblocks, who is the sponsor of today's video. You're gonna see a ton of Storyblocks footage in this video because I use Storyblocks footage in all of my videos. With a subscription to Storyblocks, you can download unlimited clips that are like high res and beautiful and royalty free for commercial and personal use. You can also get sound effects and After Effects templates. I've been using Storyblocks forever because they're amazing and incredibly cheap and unlimited downloads. Recently, Storyblocks hired 6 LGBTQIA+ directors, creators, and filmmakers to build new footage collections for their library so that these communities can be authentically represented in stock footage, something that they traditionally have not been. They're also doing this for other underrepresented communities like Black, Indigenous, and people of color. You can learn more about this initiative called Restock, as well as go subscribe to Storyblocks and get in on unlimited footage. If you click the link in my description, storyblocks.com/JohnnyHarris, clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also helps you learn more about all this cool stuff. So thank you, Storyblocks, and now enjoy the video. See ya. The longest border fence in the world today is not between India and Pakistan, or US and Mexico, or Syria and Turkey. Those are all very big, scary, long fences. But no, the longest border fence on Earth looks like this. It's 5,600 kilometers long. That's like if you were to draw a border across the whole United States from LA to New York, and then add another 1,000 miles. And this border fence doesn't even separate two countries. Instead, this fence stretches across some of the most remote territory on Earth. It goes through farmlands, deserts, across mountain ranges. But unlike most physical barriers that we use to divide countries, to keep people out, this long-ass border was built to keep out one very specific thing: dingoes.
We're here in southeast Queensland, and this is the start of the dingo fence. Now, the dingo fence was established in the 80s.
Okay, can we just say something right up front? Do we all agree that Australia is pretty wild and like a pretty unique place?
Daddy, oh, sweet.
There's a reason for this. Back when all of this was happening, all of these continents were still attached to one another. But down here, Australia jumped the gun on the whole breaking apart thing, and it broke off from all the other land way earlier than the others.
Bye, bitch.
Because of this, all the plants and animals on the Australian piece of land evolved in isolation for a really long time, far away from anything else. When we talk about the 7 continents, it's like North America, Asia, Africa, and then Australia. Like, it's a country, but it's basically its own continent. This isolation resulted in around 90% of the wildlife in Australia being wholly unique to the continent. It doesn't exist anywhere else. And it stayed this way for a very long time until, of course, these guys showed up. Another story of these guys. It's always these guys showing up from Europe. So the year is 1770, and humans had been living on Australia for like 70,000 years. But despite this, you get this guy who shows up and, quote, claims possession of the east coast of Australia for the British Crown. Soon, a bunch of British people are showing up to Australia to set up their own colony. And this is where the whole pristine, unique ecosystem thing kind of starts to fall apart. So in addition to what these British people did to the native people who were living there for 70,000 years,
massacres as systematic as those practiced against the Jews in the 20th century.
The other thing the Europeans did when they arrived here was they brought all sorts of plants and animals and a desire to do farming, all the agriculture stuff that they had been doing back in Europe. Meanwhile, Australia's 120-year-old ecosystem is like, ugh, like SMH. Like, we had perfectly balanced our ecology, and these guys are bringing camels? They also start growing a ton of non-native plants like sugar. And when they started growing sugar, there was one native species in Australia that was very excited. That native species looked like this. It's a greyback beetle who was stoked about the fact that these British people were growing sugarcane. So they just started to feast on all these sugar farms. So now the Europeans, now independent Australians, instead of being like, hey, maybe we shouldn't grow sugar here because every time we grow it, it gets infested by these beetles. Instead, they're like, let's go to Hawaii and get a bunch of frogs. The idea is that the frogs would eat the beetles and then the beetles would go away, right? But no, the frogs, or the cane toads specifically, had no natural predator in Australia. So they just exploded in their numbers and they became a pest in and of themselves.
Hey, look! Those frogs are eating all our crops!
Okay, one more example here that I have to tell you about before I get back to the border fence. One more, because I can't not talk about this. So back in 1932, emus, these like big giant weird birds, were harassing the farmers. And so the Australian government sent out the Australian Army, thousands of rounds of ammunition to fight these emus and to kill them off so that they could control the population. The best part about the story is that the emus won the war. I need to make a video specifically about the emu wars because it's just too nuts. If you want me to do that, let me know because I want to do that. Okay, so those are all the ways in which the European settlers brought invasive species to this ecologically unique place and sort of started to mess with the balance. One of the big animals that the British brought over when they were settling Australia were these guys, sheep. Sheep have wool and meat and were a big deal in England, and so the Australians were like, why not bring them halfway around the world to Australia and start sheep farming? Sheep farming began spreading all around the country as Europeans settled in Australia. But the farmers started to realize that we're not in England anymore.
No, I know we're not in Kansas.
And their sheep were starting to disappear. And it turns out that they were being hunted and eaten by an animal with a very cool name, the dingo. Dingoes are kind of like ancient wild dogs. Man, ancient wild dogs, that should be like a character in an anime film. It probably already is. Dingoes like to eat kangaroos, and in doing so, as per how ecology and natural food systems work, eating the kangaroos keeps the kangaroo population at bay. And this is very important so that we can avoid this happening too often.
He's getting mad that I'm trying to pet him. Okay, yeah, I'm done.
I'm videotaping.
No, I'm kidding. That's actually not the reason why it's important. It's important to keep the kangaroo population at bay because kangaroos eat vegetation and plants. And if they grow too large as a population, they'll eat all the plants, they'll mess with the food systems for other herbivores and the erosion and the soil content, etc., etc. The whole ecosystem relies on this balance of predator and prey.
We are all connected in the great circle of life.
So the dingoes are important. But the Europeans didn't like the dingoes because they were showing up to the farms and eating their succulent lamb chops. This became a big problem, and eventually the farmers are like, how am I supposed to raise my livestock here in this wild country with these dingoes running around eating my sheep? Meanwhile, Australia's 120 million year old ecosystem is like, deal with it, Liam, the sheep farmer. We've been crafting this wild ecosystem for a really long time and we're not gonna change it just so that you can have your lamb chops. And Liam, the sheep farmer's like, hold my beer. Oh, excuse me, hold my beer. I try not to do accents because it's kind of cliche and I can't do accents very well, but I just love the way Australians say beer.
There it is.
And thus begins another round of let's outsmart nature. So anyway, they start planning a fence. What if we cut off a giant swath of this country so that all of the dingoes stay on that side of the fence and all the sheep farmers could stay on this side of the fence? So they built the fence. It took them 8 years to construct this massive fence, the longest on Earth. And it worked. After they completed this fence, sheep deaths plummeted. And so now the farmers are very happy and the Australian government is very happy because the farmers are happy. Meanwhile, Australia's 120 million year old ecosystem is not so happy.
Not happy, Dan!
Okay, so remember the kangaroos?
He's getting mad that I'm trying to pet him.
Yeah, so on this side of the fence, there's now no dingoes, which means no one to eat the kangaroos. So the population of kangaroos skyrockets. They start eating all of the grass and vegetation. This overgrazing has left little food for the smaller plant-eating animals, whose population is now declining. And now it's also messed with the natural nutrient cycle of the soil. So now stuff doesn't grow as well in all of these soils. This change in vegetation made it easier for wind to pick up sand and create these giant dunes, which then served as like a wall to redirect the wind patterns, which changes like the weather patterns, etc., etc., etc. You build one fence to protect sheep, and you trigger a ripple effect that throws off a balance in nature that had been literally hundreds of millions of years in the making. But to the humans, it is very worth it, because the Australian sheep industry is worth $6.6 billion. The reason I'm making this video, the reason I'm fascinated with this fence, isn't just because it's so long. Yes, I like borders and lines and maps, but I also see that this fence represents an overt symbol of this very European, Western, human-centric notion of humans controlling nature. We can engineer our way out of anything. The Western world has helped create this global culture that says that we, the humans, can do whatever we need to serve our needs, whether it's food or shelter or wool. And in the process, we can ignore the needs of every other organism that shares the environment with us. And what we are seeing is that there's a cost to this. Over 1 million different species are set to be extinct in coming decades because of our activity, because we like to build fences to protect our sheep. And what's crazy is that it doesn't totally have to be this way. So much of our modern culture is sort of a blip on the map. Like, we just started this idea of going out and engineering our way out of nature. Remember that before the Europeans arrived to Australia, the Aboriginals had been living there for 70,000 years with nature, not in spite of it. They didn't need to manipulate it for their own needs in a way that threw off the balance of these ecosystems. So far, we've been able to engineer our way out of quite a lot of things. But this experiment of breaking away from natural systems is brand new, and we have no idea how much longer the natural world will tolerate it before it really bites back against the humans and puts us in our place. And maybe this is the wake-up call we need to actually start to put into practice what indigenous communities have known forever, which is that the only way for long-term survival as a species is if we learn to share this earth instead of trying always to dominate it.